Hello and welcome back. It is Thursday, July 16th. It is our 57th day of making art together. 57 days. Wow, time is going by. Hope you're having a great week and that you've been making a lot of art or thinking about it. But please, I hope you have been putting aside time for you. And time for you means time for the things you love. And sometimes setting aside time means finding out the things that we're really good at or that we really love, even if we're not really great at it or don't think we're very good at it. Putting that time aside makes us stronger and better. And like any athlete, they don't become an Olympian overnight. It takes years and years and years every day of their life working hard, building their muscle, building their endurance, their strength. Same is true for a gardener, an artist, a musician, a writer. You don't just wake up one day and say, I'm an artist or I'm going to be a writer. Maybe you do. Maybe that's how it all begins. But as time goes on, every day, the more we do it, the more we go back to it, the more we struggle and fail, and the more that we put ourselves into it, the more it builds us and helps us become who we're becoming. Helps us have that mirror of who we are and our soul out there on the page or in the writing that we're writing or in the garden that we're creating. Whatever it is for you, I hope that you're making that time for yourself. Okay, so this is our fourth day of the week. We are going to talk about Alexander Calder. He lived from, I don't have my notes in front of me, he lived from 1928 to that's not right. He lived from 1898 to 1976. He made it to 78. He was revolutionary. And I never thought about Alexander Calder being a revolutionary artist before until I started reading about him, because he is so commonplace to me in the art history life that I've studied. So Alexander Calder loved to work in mobiles. He made huge balanced works of art with movement, so a mobile. And I thought, well, of course mobiles have been around forever. No, they haven't. The first mobile was in like 1910 or 1920 in Russia. Two Russian artists made them. And then now today, of course, babies have mobiles hanging over their beds, their cribs. So it was Alexander Calder who took that idea of art in motion, art suspended and constantly moving, and really made it his art form. Not only did he love to do sculptural works like that, and if you've been to the Milwaukee Museum of Art, you'll see there's a rotunda, and in that rotunda there's a huge Calder piece hanging there, a mobile, and it's very, very cool. So he worked in a lot of the same elements, a lot of the same colors, and with that idea of balance and counterbalance and movement. So he was always working with those elements. He also loved to make little circuses. So he made a circus called Calder, and he also loved to work in wire. So he made wire portraits. He also made like wire bulls and wire circus acrobats, other things like that. So he really explored that. Now, unlike a lot of artists, Calder came from a long line of artists. His grandfather was a famous artist. His grandpa was a famous artist. His dad was a famous artist. His mom was a famous artist. His sister started an art museum. The long line of artists in his life, and then he becomes an artist and one of the most famous artists of the 21st century. So how cool is that? From this long line of artists, and he could have been anything, and he was. He studied engineering. His parents said, "You are not becoming an artist," and especially his dad, who was a sculptor, and that's what he became. He became an engineer, but of course, engineers love how things work, and maybe one of you out there is an engineer, or some of you are engineers. You like how things work, and so I'm sure that really played a part in how Calder sculpted. So we are trying our hands at Calder today. So one thing I came across is some artists out there, contemporary artists out there, whose artwork looks exactly like Alexander Calder's. And that disturbs me. We do it for fun here. We're making it, we're trying it, we're using them as inspiration, but we're not out there selling our Calder-like sculptures or mobiles. But these artists are, and they look like Calder's, and the shape of the metal, the way they hang, the design of them are very much like Alexander Calder's. So I think it's okay to borrow and learn and grow from other artists and be inspired, but I don't think it's right to take their concept and their ideas and then sell them as your own. I just don't think there's anything right about that. So what I've done is I pulled some wire, I pulled some construction papers. I'm using what I have on hand. I have some red, I have some orange, and some black. Calder like to work in black and then use other colors like yellow, blue, and red in this work as well. So you may have a coat hanger, you may have oh, I don't know what you might have. You might have a pipe cleaner, you might have nothing at all. I am sure there is something. Think really creatively. Think outside of the box about how can you make this idea of an Alexander Calder suspended motion sculpture. So I'm going to cut some random shapes like Calder would have done. I'm sure he was very intentional. I'm not going to be so intentional today. He also liked to use repetition in his work. So if he liked this shape, he might produce it over and over, and maybe in different sizes for his sculpture. So I'm going to work really quickly because we'll run short on time, as we always do in these videos. I'm going to just use some Scotch tape there. I'm going to tape my wire down. I've already started the first piece of my sculpture. Now, if you decide that you would like to explore this, you don't have the supplies, then draw. Go ahead and draw your sculpture, and then when you come into Tabor Studio someday when we're working, just say, hey, I'd like to make a mobile, and I will help you get started on that. Well, what I'll do is I'll help you get the supplies. I'll get the supplies, and then the creativity is all on you. So Alexander Calder would not have twisted his wire like that. There's just no way he would have done that. His art would have been refined, probably in his circus. His circus work, his little circus, or circus pieces, he would put them in a suitcase and carry them to be exhibited in his suitcases. So they're really cool, and they were often very rough looking. He would just use a lot of found objects. So I've talked about that this week, about using the things around us. Art should not be only for those of us who have art supplies on hand or who can afford going to an art store. That's ridiculous. If art were only for those individuals, Vincent van Gogh would have never made a piece of art in his life. And many other artists would never have picked up a paintbrush. They would have never tried their hand at sculpting. They would not have done those things because they would have thought, I can't afford it. Art is not for me. It's for the elite. But that's not true. It's for all of us. And so, especially during this pandemic, we have to remember art can be made from anything around us. So there's the start of my Calder. I know it's gonna take some work. It's not the best counterbalance. I think I would have rather taken 2 long pieces of wire and laid them across each other. But again, I've talked about this this week. I don't always execute things or plan them out. I'm not an engineer. I'm just not. So I am a trial and error artist, and that is the best that you're going to get from me. And sometimes things work, and sometimes things don't. And I'm going to add one more piece before we go here because I want to get this looking a little more like a mobile. And also this wire is a little too thick for a mobile. The mobile, you really want it to have, actually Calder would have used some very heavy materials. So even heavy materials can sway with counterbalance and have really that movement. So I don't even know what I'm talking about here. I just know I'm struggling to make this. Okay, so what am I going to do?